Do you read Sutter Kane?
I do. I fucking love Sutter Kane. Best.
If Sutter Kane was real, like if there was a real author and that shit was happening and you've never read his books, would you read his books just to see if it would possess you? Yeah. I bet you would.
I'm also the idiot that would totally watch the Ring tape.
That's why the Ouija board has a curse on you.
That's why I'm not scared of Ouija boards.
Welcome back to Ty and That Guy. I'm Wes Chatham. This is my good buddy Ty Franck. Based on that intro, you probably know what we're talking about today, but what are we talking about, Ty?
We're talking about the John Carpenter masterpiece of Lovecraftian horror. Maybe one of my favorite Lovecraftian style stories ever, In the Mouth of Madness.
It's interesting because I feel like this is the most Lovecraftian adaptation I've ever seen.
And it's not Lovecraft.
And it's not an adaptation.
Yep.
And it's not an adaptation, but I'm like, because afterwards I went back and I was like, wait a minute, was this? But it's In the Mountains of Madness. Do you remember In the Mountains?
That's right. Yeah, and I think he deliberately titled it to be reminiscent of that, so that it feels like a Lovecraft title. But it's not.
What was interesting about this movie is going back and watching it. This is definitely a John Carpenter movie I haven't rewatched in a long time. But there are images in this movie that are seared in my brain. So because I didn't remember like the beginning, middle, and end of the story, but I just remember scenes and images, and they're seared in my brain. Like the old lady with her tied up husband that was naked underneath the thing, or
she's like kicking under the desk.
Yeah, or that old boy, the old boy that was like trapped in an eternal loop, and you see him in the old man look at her face. That shit was like seared in my brain.
And another one that's like that that was always seared in my brain is the scene in the alley with the people beating up the guy in the alley, and they all turn and look at him when he looks down there, and it's so creepily staged.
Which version of that? Because it was kind of
there's two versions of it.
There's three versions.
Are there three? Okay,
yeah.
Well, I'm thinking of two, but yeah, it like gets progressively worse every time he looks down the alley.
Yeah.
Like just stop looking down that alley. Every time you look down that alley, something goes worse.
It was because I love those reoccurring things where you can see like it's kind of a measuring stick of where they are psychically as they're going forward. When did you see this for the first time?
I think I saw this in the theater. I think this is one I went to the theater for. I think I was living in Portland at the time. I think this is when Janae and I lived in Portland.
Do you count this as one of Carpenter's greats, or do you count it as a good Carpenter?
I think for me it would probably be in my top 5.
Okay, so it's in the greats.
Yeah, and I mean it is definitely one of his, like, I mean, it's not a masterpiece like Halloween. It's not. But it is an extremely good and effective horror movie. It is a very well-made movie. It's creepy. It's scary. I think it does what it's trying to do really well. So it ranks up there as a very good movie, but it's not a great. You know?
I think it's his best movie of the 90s.
For sure. I have heard people make the argument that it's the last really good movie made.
Right.
And I definitely think it was a high bar in that sort of last phase of his career, or this later phase of his career.
It felt like this for me. I went to see Guns N' Roses in Vegas not too long ago, and I went to the concert and had a fucking blast. And they played all the music, and it was great. Axl Rose sounded good, and I do, you know, I mean, I might have consumed some substances before the show, so I'm not really that reliable. But the point I'm making is like I really enjoyed the concert. All the notes were hitting in the right way. Axl Rose sounded great, but it was something a little bit not hitting the level that they once were.
Of course not. And they're never going to hit that level again.
Yeah, and to me, that's what this movie was for me. It was like all the stuff that I love about Carpenter, all the stuff that was hitting or whatever. And so when I watched it, I really enjoyed it, but I didn't enjoy it like The Thing level enjoying it. And I understand that's like of course not. That's an impossible bar, but I'm just trying to give an understanding of like my experience watching it where I very much enjoyed it. It is for me probably, I don't know anything post this John Carpenter that I would say I love, but I never saw like Ghost of Mars. I never saw, I never wanted to be disappointed or like heartbroken, you know.
If you love John Carpenter, do not watch Ghost of Mars.
Okay. What I learned new about this is Mike DeLuca wrote this, the guy that used to run New Line. And
oh, really?
Yeah, and I was really surprised by that because, and then you go back and look at some of the stuff that he's written, and what's interesting is like he ran New Line, but he was also a screenwriter.
Yeah,
and he written some movies, but this is by far the best thing that he wrote. He did write the Dream Warrior, Nightmare on Elm Street.
Oh yeah, I remember that one.
But this is by far the best thing he ever wrote, and he was a huge Lovecraft fan, and you can see this. And also, John Carpenter is a huge Lovecraft fan. Now, one thing I wanted to talk to you about is John Carpenter talks about his Apocalypse trilogy, and this is the last of the Apocalypse trilogy. And I thought that's always kind of confused me. And I thought about
is Prince of Darkness one of those?
Yeah.
What's the other one?
It's The Thing, Prince of Darkness, and this one. And he's always called it. And I've heard him in interviews talk about it, but I never really fully understood why. And I really thought about it before this. And I guess the one thing that they all have in common is the world as we know it is different going forward. But then wouldn't They Live be a part of that Apocalypse trilogy if that is the one theme that unites all the movies? Like what unites?
No, because They Live is a revolution story. I mean, you get by the end of They Live, you get the sense that the humans are going to fight back and kill all the aliens and retake their planet, right?
Right. Yeah, but the world as they know it is certainly different.
Sure. If I may interpret what he's done. And not having heard him describe it this way, so this is just my thing, is all three of those movies, you are dealing with a extinction level event. If the thing gets loose, if the thing gets out of that base and gets to humanity's dead. That's the end, right? Prince of Darkness is the same thing. They discover this thing. If that thing gets out of that container and gets loose in the world's over, right? And then I think that's also with In the Mouth of Madness. This is the end of the world. It's an end of the world scenario.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's the world is different as you know it, and then that difference will lead to human extinction. Now, Lovecraft was somebody that I used to read, and I was always kind of fascinated with him. He wasn't my favorite. There was something when I would read his stories, I would just feel unsettled. I'd feel like dirty. And going back to this movie, and I felt like it really hit the Lovecraftian and cosmic horror feeling. And then I went back and tried to identify what was that thing about Lovecraft that I was always kind of drawn to, but then always kind of like regretted it after I read it. And one of the things to me, there's a book of letters that he wrote, and this is a quote from the book of letters. It says, "Now all of my tales are based on the fundamental premise that common human laws and interest and emotions have no validity or significance in the vast cosmos at large." And one of the things he has in common is he always has these ancient beings that used to have ultimate power on the earth, and they're clawing their way back, and eventually they will be there. And one of the things about The Expanse that I always felt was very Lovecraftian, and you might disagree with me, the beings that killed the things that created the protomolecule, right? Those vast cosmic creatures that are so far beyond what we are, it gave me that Lovecraftian feeling where like, it's such a cold, hard universe out there, and we are just an anthill that eventually, our clock is ticking. We will eventually be run over, and so
and that is very Lovecraftian and deliberately so. Let me start with this way. So you say that he wasn't one of your favorites, but you always felt a little weird, unsettled after reading his stuff. That's what Lovecraft was. Lovecraft was never a great storyteller. Lovecraft never had riveting plots or brilliant characterization or any of those sorts of things. That was not his strength. Lovecraft's strength was in evoking a feeling, in evoking a sense of doom, right? That so it was more about a mood that he was creating and hopelessness. He was much better creating a mood than in telling a story or creating interesting characters. That's why so many other writers glommed onto his work, because all these other writers, they wanted to borrow that feeling he had created and then stick a story in it. And so all the best Lovecraft stories are not written by Lovecraft. And Lovecraft very early on said, anybody can write in my universe. He was very open about that. Like he didn't care if other people used his worlds and his creations for their own stories. And so a lot of writers did. And I think that's what In the Mouth of Madness is sort of one of those sorts of stories where it's you're taking this mood that Lovecraft was so good at creating, but you're sticking a completely different thing in it, right? An actual story with actual characters and all that kind of stuff.
And so now going back to the movie as we get started with it, but I think one of the reasons that this movie ended up being sparking for Carpenter, ended up being one of his last great movies, is the budget got cut. So they were supposed to make it at 20 million, and it got slashed to 8 million.
Oh my God!
Yeah, 8 million.
That is an insane amount to take out of the budget.
That is significant. So at the end when he rips his face and it turns into the book, the whole town was supposed to be swallowed in his face, and so they had to pivot on that. And you can even tell at the end when he goes back to the alley the third time, and then it's just a blank alley with the fire and the idea of the apocalypse was just a car turned over and some burnt and some barrels with fire in it, and you're like, oh, that's the visual apocalypse. Like that could be just a street in Escape from New York. Yeah, exactly. Escape, but that was the apocalypse, and then him going to the theater. But I think that there's something about Carpenter when his back's against the wall and he has no money and has no time. I think that brings out the best in him.
I agree with that because we can go through the movie in finer detail, but I think the ending of the movie is fantastic. I think it is a super low budget version of the end of this kind of movie, and I think it works perfectly for the mood and setting that Carpenter has been developing up to that point. So I think in that case, you're right. His back was against the wall, and he came up with something I think that's brilliant.
What's interesting is I wonder how that conversation happened with the budget getting slashed, because if I think the beginning of the movie looks more polished and like they have more money than the end of the movie. Yeah. So I wonder if it was something as the movie was shooting or as it was going, money was being taken away from them.
That would be devastating. Like if you're planning to make a $20 million movie and then the studio comes and says you only have 8 million, that sucks, but you can revise your plans, right? Mm-hmm. If you're already shooting, if you've already started shooting days and they come and go, oh, you thought you had 20 million, but now you only have 8. I don't know how you recover from that.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know what you would do because you've already built your schedule. You've already figured everything out. And now they go, oh, by the way, 60% of your budget is gone. Yeah. That means 60% of your shooting days are gone. I mean, that's a huge deal.
And there are directors that can make an amazing movie when they have an endless supply of money. And then if they get down and they have to get scrappy, there's people like Carpenter that thrive in that. And there's other directors that don't do well in that situation. Yep. But on the inverse, I don't think Carpenter thrives when he has an abundance of money and time. And
I actually agree with that. I think the best Carpenter is the scrappy guerrilla filmmaker Carpenter, the Escape from New York Carpenter. The Thing Carpenter, now we've talked about The Thing was his only real studio movie, but you still got that sense of the guerrilla filmmaker in him when he made that one. Yeah, and then when they give him a bunch of studio money and all that stuff, you wind up with Tales of the Invisible Man or whatever what was that one with Chevy Chase?
Oh, Memoirs of an Invisible Man.
Memoir of an Invisible Man. Yeah, which it's a well-made movie, but it's not a great movie.
Yeah. And just to stay zoomed out before we really get into the movie, the premise of this really terrifies me. And it's something that I really enjoy and that I've forgotten about. Yeah. And when I go back and watch this, the premise of it is terrifying because you and I talk about story all the time. And if you control somebody's stories, you can control their reality. You can control how they perceive the reality. And we often forget how vulnerable reality really is, how vulnerable truth is. And for instance, like I was helping my oldest last night do his homework. He's doing social studies homework, and we're reading about the Spanish when they were trying to find a route to China, and they ended up discovering North America. And you're reading each specific story and each specific voyage. And as I'm reading that, I was thinking, I was like, this is who's writing the logs and who's putting the stories and who chooses what because this stories that I'm telling my kid is shaping his reality, and he's using it to orient himself with the world. So it's so powerful. And this movie captures that in saying that, I think that this movie's heavily inspired by Lovecraft, obviously. Stephen King was referenced.
Sutter Kane is a clear Stephen King stand-in.
But I think also L. Ron Hubbard in a lot of ways, because he was, a well-known science fiction writer, but he ended up taking his writing to another level, which created a religion, and that religion shaped a lot of people's reality.
For sure.
Going forward. So the idea of in knowing how obsessed I am with story and know how susceptible I am to certain things like that, this terrifies me. Where you have this collective consciousness that gets taken over.
Like most things in fiction, especially in genre fiction, it is an exaggeration of something that is true. And not to get too political, because we don't really get political, but the last 10, 20 years in America has made it very clear that there are groups of Americans who live in a completely different reality from each other. The facts that they believe are true about the world don't match at all the facts that the other group believes is true about the world. And they're not even compatible. It's like you got two groups of people. They look up at the sky. One group goes, the sky is clearly red. And the other group goes, no, it's clearly blue. And there's no way to reconcile that. So you got these people who are living in wildly different versions of reality. And it shapes the way they behave, and it shapes the choices that they make about the world and the things that they do. And it's kind of terrifying. It's kind of terrifying that you can meet somebody and they just live in a different version of reality than you do. And you can't tell from the outside. When you look at somebody, you can't tell from the outside. But if you start talking to them, you go, oh, wow, you are living in another, the world you inhabit is not the world that I inhabit. And what the Sutter Kane story in Mouth of Madness is doing is the exaggerated version of that he's telling a story so compelling that the people who read it get moved to this other reality. And it's not just a intellectual other reality. It is actually a physically other reality. Yeah. So it's just an exaggeration of what we already see.
Exactly. And not to go too deep into what you're saying, but I think that there are certain people where what bothers me is when I'm like, how did they come to that conclusion? How can they think, where's the evidence? What bothers me is like, I know that there's rational people out there that think different than me. Where are they getting that information? Yeah. And how different is that information? Like, how could we be so far apart in understanding? And I also think that people are getting siloed or hunkered down in their own way of thinking with their own people, because even like I like to go on YouTube and watch, like, do you remember the Gore Vidal and William F. Buckley debates? Or there was like public forums where ideas would come and joust. And then as you see people debate and you see on these popular TV shows and you see them, Gore Vidal and William F. Buckley, and when you see them doing their thing, then you can look at it and be like, well, that's kind of exposed. Like, people, but if you don't have that and you just have the same silos of hearing the same shit over and over and over and validating and patting on the back, you're patting them on the back, then you don't have, but I don't want to go into that.
Yes, we don't want to get too political, but the thing that has happened that I think Mouth of Madness is playing off of is that we've reached a point now, you're calling it a silo. That's a good description, where people they pick which reality they want to live in, and they can actually curate the information that they get, so that they only get information that reinforces this reality they choose to live in. And that's an unusual thing about our world now that didn't used to exist. And I think what part of the brilliance of In the Mouth of Madness, it's sort of prescient, right? It anticipates that world before it happened, which, sometimes stories accidentally predict the future. And I think Mouth of Madness, that kind of has it's kind of predicting the future a little bit,
100%. The people running around and being insane and being possessed by this knowledge because there's a narrative that is like thrust into their head. well, let's get into the movie. Let's set us up a little bit here.
Yeah, well, I mean, the story is that we have an investigator, an insurance investigator, because a popular author has disappeared. He has disappeared with the most recent manuscript that he's written. The publisher has paid millions and millions of dollars for this manuscript, and they want the manuscript back because otherwise there's going to be a huge insurance claim for this thing. And so they send this investigator to go track this guy down, find out if he's got the manuscript, get it back. And, it starts out very sort of classic private investigator kind of story. Here's this thing. It's worth millions of dollars. It's disappeared. We send an investigator to go get it. So it's a very sort of real world beginning, but it has right out of the gate. This is one of the things I appreciate about the movies. It sets up this sort of real world beginning to the story. That's the Sam Neill character as the investigator. Right away, you have some weird shit happen. Like, he's in the coffee shop talking to somebody about the investigation, and a dude shows up with a fire axe and shatters the window and comes in and is screaming all this crazy stuff at him, where you're like, what the fuck, right? So immediately, even though the beginning is very sort of like based in real things, insurance investigations and missing guys.
Well, not the prologue. Not the prologue,
but I'm talking about just the regular movie.
Right.
Even though it starts out in this very, it feels like a very normal story, right up almost immediately we got crazy shit happening with the guy showing up with the axe.
Right.
And that begins our story.
Yeah. And we will talk about the prologue. Sam Neill gets dragged into this insane asylum. He's freaking out. He's violent. He's fighting against these guys.
Yeah.
They throw him into a padded room. He's in a straitjacket. What's the guy's David Warner, that actor? And I love
David Warner.
And every time I see him, I think Tron. I remember him he was like Ed Dillinger for Tron. But so he goes in there.
Voiced the bad guy in one of my favorite video games of all time.
What game is that?
He voices the main bad guy in Baldur's Gate 2. No, in Baldur's Gate 2.
Oh,
Baldur's Gate 2. He voices the main bad guy. Yeah.
So shout out to him. But what I really loved about the prologue is the referencing how there's others like this guy, that there's something catching on and he's like, how bad is it out there? And nothing is spelled out, nothing, but you realize that whatever's happening to him is happening, and this guy's trying to control it, and you can tell he's scared.
Yeah. And I would describe it less as a prologue and more as the first half of a frame story. So there's a framing story that's been put in place, and this is the first half of that framing story. Then we get the meat of the movie, and then we get the second half of the framing story at the end.
Right.
Yeah.
So what would be different than how would you describe a prologue and then a framing story? So
a prologue is typically things that happen before the events of the movie. When you're talking about a framing story like this, it is not connected to the timeline of the events of the movie. So a frame story is like in Abyss, the old lady talking about the missing gem, right? The old lady talking
Titanic?
Not Abyss, Titanic. Yeah. Thank you. In Titanic, when she's talking about the missing gem, that's a frame story. It's not a prologue, right?
Yeah.
And that's this same kind of thing. It's sort of because the Sam Neill getting thrown into the insane asylum happens after the events of the movie we're about to see, so it doesn't predate those events.
Mm-hmm. Do you like those framing type stories, meaning that some things are in style and some things come on, like flashbacks come in and out of style? When you see that, what do you think? Your taste now, presently, when you see that, do you enjoy it?
Sometimes it works. I actually think in The Mouth of Madness, that frame story does work.
Yeah,
I like that it sets us up that some crazy stuff's going to happen, and then I think the second half of the frame story is really good.
Yeah,
and it pays off. It pays off the opening bit of the frame story really well. So I like that one. You watch Titanic. Do I need the old lady talking about the gem? Probably not. Right? I mean, I love Bill Paxton. I'm happy that James Cameron gave Bill Paxton some more work. That's great. I don't know that I needed that frame story. And sometimes movies will tack a frame story on, and you're like, And especially in low budget films, like I watch a lot of low budget films, as you know, they love to do the frame story. And the reason they love to do the frame story is because they can start out with a gunfight, like right out the in media res, right? Like immediately you start out and the guy's running through as he's shooting guns, and it's like 4 weeks earlier. You know, it's like, oh, come on, just start the story where it starts. We don't need this shit. I think the frame story in The Mouth of Madness actually adds to the movie rather than takes away from it. I think it's good.
When I see a frame story done well, then when I see it, I'm like, oh, this is great, I like it. But when I've seen it done not well, then I'm like, ah, it annoys me. And it's like everything else. It's like if somebody's masterfully does it and has a good purpose, then and this is one of those reasons. But I want to give a shout out to John Glover before we move on, because John Glover and Charlton Heston, who was in this movie, are in the greatest Christmas movie ever made, which is Scrooged with Bill Murray. And so it was like, it's because I see John Glover and I'm like, oh, fuck, I forgot he was in this. And then you're watching it. And then I see Charlton Heston. And I'm like, first of all, why is Charlton Heston here? But awesome. And then second of all,
he's in it for like 5 minutes.
I know. He's in it for 5 minutes, you know? And I'm like, this is Omega Man. Oh, so yeah, going into the trial where basically you see Sam Neill, he's the investigator. He's got the 411 on this other guy. And that other guy, let me think, Peter Jason, we got to give a shout out to him because I think he has been in more John Carpenter movies than any other actor. John Carpenter, yeah. So I think that's really cool because when you see him, the only time I recognize him is in John Carpenter movies because I see him, I'm like, oh, I remember him Escaping New York, and then I remember him this, and I remember him that. But you go in and he's worked a lot. But I couldn't tell you I could tell you all the John Carpenter movies he's in, but I couldn't tell you the other stuff. But he's worked a lot. But you know, he's fucking sweating in there. It has a very kind of noirish kind of, he's smoking and Sam Neill's smoking and he's got him there. And then,
I'm glad that you mentioned that because all of the early Sam Neill stuff is deliberately very noir. Right? It's very Sam Spade, the private detective, gonna go track the guy down, and everybody kind of looks like they're a little sweaty and, you know, it's, like you said, it's smoke-filled rooms. It's very, very sort of Humphrey Bogart at the beginning.
And Sam Neill has that everyman kind of vibe to him. Like he's kind of handsome, but he's not too handsome, but he's clever and he's tough, and you have him in there. And the only unforgivable sin, the fashion that bugs me the most, for whatever reason, which offends me, is 90s yuppie, like early 90s yuppie, like the big jackets and the thing. Yeah, I just can't fucking take it. But other than that, Sam Neill's great. Like his fucking gigantic jacket with his big fucking pants, and it's like has the anyway. And then, but I also think it was a bit of a waste of Bernie Casey. You know, I remember Bernie Casey from Revenge of the Nerds. And like when he comes on the screen, he's the guy that you watch. He's the guy, he has an incredible screen presence. Do you remember Revenge of the Nerds? Like when they had to apply for his fraternity and he's in there, and it's like, you know, and do you know what I'm talking about? Bernie Casey?
No. Okay. I know who Bernie Casey is, but I've only seen Revenge of the Nerds once. Okay,
well, it didn't age well, so I probably shouldn't talk about it. Let's strike it from the record. We don't want to promote Revenge of the Nerds. But anyway, you know, it's got Bernie Casey in there, and I felt like I wanted to see him more. It was a bit of a waste of him. But now you got this hotshot insurance investigator who knows what he's doing. He's smart, but he's a cynic. He's cynical. Now, as soon as you get grounded back in reality and you kind of forget a little bit about the madness that you see up front, then I think this is the most powerful scene in the whole movie. When you see, and it's classic John Carpenter, when you see the guy in the background, he comes out of his office and he's kind of pushing people out of the way, and he looks across and he sees Sam Neill, and he takes out his axe and he's walking across the street, and they're just having a casual conversation. And then he comes up and fucking shatters the glass, and he's like, "Do you read Sutter Kane?" And he has like those weird like fish eyes with like it's divided in two.
I agree. I think it might be the best shot in the entire movie. And for exactly the reason you described, because in the foreground, we've got the two guys in the table and the window behind them. The whole thing is silently developing behind them. Like, you don't hear anything from that, right? It's just this guy walking across the street with the axe. And your eye is immediately drawn to him. It's so well framed that your eye is immediately drawn to that guy. And you're like, what the fuck is that? Where's that guy going with that axe? So it's so like you see it coming and you're like tensing up for it. And it's still so startling when he smashes out the window with the axe and asks that question. It is absolutely classic John Carpenter. John Carpenter at his best in that kind of shot. But it leads up to, so the next thing that happens is he gets paired up with the woman from the publisher.
Styles.
Becomes sort of his partner for this investigation. And then we get to the drive to the town. But I also like the investigation that lets them find the town is clever. They show them, like, he's looking at all the books, right?
Oh, yeah, we forgot about
looking at all the books.
Yeah.
And then you see him go, and all of them have like little pieces of what look like maybe a map on them. And he just starts tearing the covers off all the books and putting them like a puzzle together and winds up with that map that is supposed to be the map to the fictional town of Hobs End, which is very Stephen King. Because, you know, Stephen King had that fictional town in New England that a lot of his stories take place in, right? And Castle Rock. And so Hobs End is sort of Sutter Kane's Castle Rock. And by piecing all of these book covers together, we wind up with the map to Hobs End, which I thought was really clever. And then when you get the drive to Hobs End, that's when shit starts to get weird.
And this is that whole drive to Hobs End is my favorite sequence in the movie. That is the kind of horror, suspense, and mystery that I really love. And
talk about the kid with the bike.
Yeah, and we're going to get... But doesn't it feel, some points in this movie, like a bit David Lynch? Do you get that vibe?
It doesn't feel like David Lynch to me, but I could absolutely see David Lynch making a movie like this.
Okay.
I mean, it would feel very different, I think, if Lynch made it. And by the way, now I really want to see the Lynch version of a Lovecraft movie. Holy shit, do I want to see that?
There are some of the highway stuff that I have seen in Lynch movies before. And then... Well,
Lynch is fascinated by driving down roads. He has, all of his movies have sequences where people are going down roads. I think Lynch is fascinated by the idea of a thing stretching off into darkness and you can only see this little patch in front of you. I think he likes the symbolism of that a lot because he uses it a lot.
Yeah.
And we definitely have that in this sequence.
Yeah. Seeing the kid appear, you see that she's driving down the road. They let it be long and ominous as it's going. And then you see a figure. And then as they pull up on the figure, it's a little kid and he's scared and he's riding the shit out of his bike. Yep. And you're like, what the fuck is he doing on the road at like 3 a.m? And who is this kid and what's he running from? And then when she passes him and what he turns into.
So one of the things that this movie does over and over and over again, and I think quite effectively, is it starts out with something that's a little weird, but not weird to the point where it's not a thing that could happen in real life, right? Like a kid riding the shit out of their bike at 3 a.m, like they're scared. That would be weird if you saw it, but you wouldn't assume you're now in a supernatural place, right? You'd just be, oh, I wonder what happened to that kid, right? But what he keeps doing is he'll show you the thing that's weird, but believable. And then the next time you see it, it's, oh no, we've crossed into the Twilight Zone. Some Twilight Zone shit is happening now. And then everything goes off the rails. And he does that over and over again. And the kid is one of the instances that you see the kid, it's weird. Then you see the kid again, and you're like, what? How are we seeing the same kid a second time? This is some time loop Twilight Zone shit. And then the third time you see the kid, it's just, okay, now it's off the rails, right?
Yeah.
And he uses that same repeating motif over and over through this movie.
Well, and then because of the third time, he's a 90-year-old man.
Yeah.
And what's terrifying is, so she sees the kid, and then you see somebody else riding, and it looks back, and it's like an old man, and you're like, oh shit, what is this old man doing riding the kid's bike? What happened to the kid? Right. And then when they pull over, the old man's talking in the kid's voice.
Yep.
And there's so much communicated in that imagery because you obviously are now at this point like, oh, he's on some kind of loop, and he's saying that he won't let me leave in the kid's voice. And then you just have the immediate impression that, oh, they've been trapped. This kid has been trapped in this loop for years and years and years, and he can't get out. And that's terrifying.
That's terrifying. That's what I'm saying. And it's that 3-part thing. He does it again with the old lady at the hotel. The 3-part. You see it. First time is weird. Second time is what the fuck. Third time is like, okay, we're off the rails now. Right?
And the painting at the hotel. Yeah.
So he keeps doing that. Even though he repeats it over and over again, it's effective every time. You know, the kids running through the street. He does that. The first time it's like, oh, that's weird. The second time, well, this is okay with some Twilight Zone shit. And then the third time it's off the rails, right? You kind of get this sense of we're in this. The way I describe it is we're spiraling down sort of the drain here. And as we get, you know, it's faster and faster and faster the lower we get, but we keep moving through these patterns of this 3-part thing and just building up to this super fast, high energy ending. So yeah, it's really, the movie is really well constructed.
Mm-hmm. You know, you brought up Twilight Zone. We always talk about how obsessed we are with Twilight Zone, but yes, I get a Lynchian kind of Twilight Zone vibe from this. And then the visual aspect of it just going completely black, and she's riding in darkness, and then she looks down and there's a lightning, and it's like she's driving over like hell, like lightning,
right?
And lava and fire. And then you think she wrecks, and then she wakes up, and it's a peaceful, beautiful, bucolic town day, just passed over this bridge, and she has no fucking idea how she's got there. They both wake up, and he's like, oh, we're here. And they look over, and there's a sign, and that's Hobs End.
Yeah. Well, yes, because clearly at some point in the night, we transitioned out of our world into some other world.
The Twilight Zone.
Yeah. We're in this other world now. Yeah.
And this whole setup is just so well done because there's nobody in the town. You know, they go and it's all the shops and the stores and nobody's there. And she sees something he doesn't see. And it's this dog that's running for its fucking life. And then there's these kids running behind it. And it's almost like he slows the frames down. It's not slow motion, but it's like they're running slower, chasing this dog. And there's something so scary. It reminds me, you know, one of the funniest stories when you and I were talking about Children of the Corn. And we both came to realization, it's like, wait a minute, we'll fuck up, kid. We'll fuck a kid up. You know what I'm saying? Like, those kids won't stand a fucking chance. But these kids, you're like, oh, wait.
They're a little scary. Yeah, and you're right. It's like he just ran the camera just a little faster. You know, just a few more frames. Like, you know, instead of running 24, he ran like 28 or 30. You just get a few extra, you know, a little bit of slowing down going on there. And it just makes it a little more eerie. And you're like, what the fuck are they going to do to that dog? You know, because it doesn't come across as like kids chasing a dog for fun. No. It comes across as like they're trying to fuck this dog up, and the dog's running for its life.
Yeah, that's a good call. It's like somehow he created this ominous thing of like when they're chasing him, you don't think there's nothing about it that seems like, oh, these kids are having fun with a dog. And, you know, you talk about threes. He uses threes. You see them again chasing the dog, and the dog has 3 legs.
Yep.
And it has like a bloody stump, and it was like going on 3 legs. And you're like, oh, now I know why they were chasing him.
Yeah, it's fucked up. Yeah. And so now once we get to the town, like the Sam Neill character is still trying to see this as a real thing. He's the skeptic. He's the cynical skeptic, right? Who's like, no, this is just an insurance scam. I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to get the manuscript back. He's desperately trying to hang on to that worldview, right? But we, the audience, are seeing some shit. We're like, no, Sam, you're reading this scene wrong. There's some shit going on here, man. The checking into the hotel, the little bed and breakfast kind of place, the creepy old lady who checks them in, the weird painting on the wall.
Who's also in a lot of David Lynch stuff, that lady.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. She is the classic creepy old lady. We get this feeling as an audience that we're descending into, like we're moving into the dream state now, right? Like things are not quite real. And we're getting this, like, we're not quite at the nightmare yet. We haven't reached the nightmare yet, but we're drifting into the dream state.
And his cynicism is built in the character. And one of the things what's interesting is because he thinks that they're setting all this up as a publicity stunt.
Yes.
That they're doing this. And so the more weird shit he sees, he's like, that's a good one. All right, I know what the fuck you're doing. This is because, so the more weird it gets, the more he thinks it's a publicity stunt. Because once they realize that, oh no, we're living in Sutter's books, then he's like, oh, you set all of this up to sell these books.
Yep.
So he gets more and more entrenched in his idea, and which is terrifying for us because we're like, no,
dude,
that's
not a setup.
This is not a setup. Get the fuck
out of there.
This is not a setup. Get the fuck out of there.
Yeah. No, there's it's that classic, you're watching the horror movie and you're like, just jump out the window. Just jump out the window. Get out of there right now. Just run away. Just get the fuck out. Stop investigating. Stop trying to figure out what's going on. Just get in your car and get the fuck out. But that is the greatness of this nightmare scenario that Carpenter is slowly building for us. Even once people realize what's going on and try to get away, it's impossible to escape. You're trapped in the dream now. And once you're trapped in the dream, you don't get to leave the dream. And you're just stuck in there. And so it is the wonderful, like the whole town becomes a haunted house, right? You're not allowed to leave the haunted house until the ghost lets you leave, right? Yeah.
And when he gets to the point where he can no longer ignore it, is when they go to the church.
Yes.
And they go to that major cathedral church. And she, by the way, the whole time is pointing it out, like Frances Bay, whatever her name is, in the lady, she's like, she's from the books. And he's like,
yep.
That sweet old lady, whoever that person was, book, she killed her husband and chopped him up. She goes, that fucking lady wouldn't be able to do that.
Yeah.
And then it keeps going and going until they finally get to the church. And then he can't deny that there's this big cathedral in the middle of nowhere. And all of these fucking cars, these pickup trucks. And these are the first time you see people, or grown people, adults. Yeah. And they come out and they got their shotguns. And Vigo the Carpathian is there.
Vigo the Carpathian. Yeah.
And you're like, what is Vigo the Carpathian doing here? And then also, like, he's like kind of supposed to be a townie, like a small town guy, but he still has that like thick accent. Yeah. And he's like, where's my boy? And this kind of reminded me, this has a Damien feel, because the churches, the doors are going back and forth, and then you see the little boy, and then it slams and it opens, and Sutter Kane is there. Yeah.
And the church itself is wrong, because no town of that size would have a cathedral like that. Like it's so out of place. It's like if you went to like a town with like 800 people and there was a like 100-story office building in the middle of it. You'd be like, what? What the fuck is this doing here, right? Like this belongs in New York. Yeah, like a high-rise office building in the middle. You're like, this belongs in New York. This doesn't belong here. And the cathedral's like that. You're like if I was in London, maybe I would expect to see that cathedral.
Or Italy,
Italy, but not in this little, like, this town looks like it has like 200 people in it.
And
wasn't that cathedral doing?
Isn't there a cross? I know there's one inside, but wasn't there like an upside down cross on the outside when you go up there?
There might be. I don't remember.
I don't remember that. But there's certainly enough. Well, even if you see that cathedral, when he sicks the Dobermans on those people and they start tearing them apart, then you got to be like, some shit's going down in this place,
Yeah. So there's actual devil dogs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Devil dogs. And what's interesting is when he gets back to the hotel, he goes from confident in his cynicism to holding on to dear life to his cynicism.
That's what I was saying. The Samuel character is desperately trying to hang on to this belief that everything is still real, everything is still normal, this is all just a big game, this is all just a big thing, but it's getting harder and harder to hang on to it. And his insistence on it actually pushes him over to madness, because he has to ignore the reality that he's seeing to cling to this belief that he has.
What would be interesting to see, you talked about earlier, Sam, Neil, and he kind of reminds you of like a Bogart character. Yeah. But imagine like Bogart in this situation. Imagine like the Big Sleep Bogart in this situation. Like, how would he handle it? It's pretty fascinating to think about.
Big Sleep Bogart would already have busted a cap in somebody. Bogart's the minute all that shit goes down at the church,
Yeah.
Sam Spade's got his 45 in his hand and he's just laying down the law.
Right. But, you know, to me, and then this is the other most powerful visual that I remember from my psyche from my childhood watching it, is that he goes back to the room with her. They're talking it over. He's insisting. He's hanging on with both hands, but he's starting to falter. And he goes downstairs. He sees the painting now. And now they're looking with these monster faces. Yep. And then he's talking to Frances Bay at the counter, and she has these dark circles under his eyes. And you could tell he's looking, and he's like, don't be that. Don't be that. Like, you're the last person.
Don't be the lady who chopped your husband up.
And then he hears her husband moaning underneath the table and when underneath the counter. And when the camera goes down and you see her naked old husband that's just all beat up and underneath the table and chained up, that visual is so it's seared into your brain. And that, if you asked me about in The Math of Madness, I would have said the guy with the axe and breaking the window, and then this one. And so that's that was a good one. Yeah, no,
I mean, because horror is all about cognitive dissonance. It's all about contradiction, right? Horror isn't like a robbery gone wrong where somebody gets shot. Like, we understand that. There's no dissonance there, right? Horror is a sweet little lady standing at the desk with her husband tied up and beat the shit at her feet, because that doesn't belong together. Like, our brain doesn't know what to do with that.
Yes.
That's what horror is.
Right. And I think that's when this movie is at its best. When I see the kid on the bike, when I see the guy with the axe that's breaking the thing, when I see this lady, those things are all spooky and scare me. Just me personally, when we start getting to the monsters, so when he walks out and there's a monster that was in a story that's there, and he looks back and he sees the monster when he's going for the car that's in the greenhouse, or even the monsters that are chasing him. I don't want to jump ahead, but to me personally, those are not as effective to me. Monsters are not effective as these psychological horror things.
Yeah, I agree, but we also need to show the world collapsing into fiction madness, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like an old lady who kills her husband with an axe. It's weird, it's super creepy, but it could happen in the real world. Mm-hmm. Once you see a fucking monster, you are not in the real world anymore, right? Mm-hmm. And we need those moments of, no, this is not just some crazy publicity stuff. This is not just some criminal-minded, because criminal-minded people can do some pretty horrific things. This isn't that. Mm-hmm. This isn't just criminals.
Yeah.
This is some crazy, out of the id monster shit that could not exist in the real world. Now, Carpenter didn't have enough money to do incredibly great versions of those monsters, and that's kind of messes with the...
He had ILM, but this is early,
Yeah,
it was ILM that did this, but it was still early.
He had $8 million to spend on monsters. He didn't have $20 million to spend on monsters.
Well, help me figure this out, because when I watch The Thing, people talk about dated or whatever. The datedness never bothers me. It never takes me out. But at the end of the day, the monster is not what scares me. It's the paranoia of who could or couldn't be is the thing that scares me. And so in this movie, as I'm watching his reality unraveling, the things that scare me, and I get your point, and I think it's right, and it makes sense in the movie. But when they go full monsters coming out and chasing him, when that's the apex of it, that is the least scary for me.
Right.
That takes that kind of. I'm just not. So the Thing, the paranoia and the mood and the suspicion between the people is what scares me. The monster is the least scary part. Now, in saying that, when she starts shape shifting, there's some really spooky moments in there.
Yeah,
with her.
And I think so. If you saw a full on, straight out of a horror film monster in real life, there are two horrific things about that. One is the monster itself, but the second horrific thing about it is that moment where you go, the world I thought I lived in is not the world that I actually live in. And there's a sort of an existential and even beyond just existential, but like now I am confronted not only with my own personal death, possibly, but I am confronted with the death of everything I believed was. And I think that's what they're trying for with the Sam Neill character when the monsters show up, is they are undeniably not part of the world he thought he lived in. And now he is confronted with, oh shit, I actually am in this motherfucker's book. I actually am in the book. I'm not in my world anymore. Yeah. And that's supposed to be the horror of it.
And it is the point of no return, because he kept holding, he holds on, and it escalates and it escalates. He tried to leave 3 times.
Yep.
And he would drive out and it would shoot him right back in the town. And he would drive out and shoot it right back in the town. So when you get to the point, I understand why it's there, I understand why the story is there. When you get to the point where the monsters are chasing him out, that is his point, that he is now in the story, and even he can't deny it. He's up against the wall, and even he can't deny it.
But having said all of that, I agree that big rubber monsters chasing you is not as scary as the old lady in the hotel or the kid with the old man face, or it's not as spooky as those. It's more just sort of straightforward, like, oh, okay, it's a monster.
A moment that always gets me is when you realize that you were powerless and overmatched. And so when he's talking to Sutter Kane, he basically is saying, you don't really exist. I wrote you.
Right.
And then him having the realization that he doesn't really exist. And
that
then
he's just a character in a book.
He's just a character in a book. And to me, that is so deflating that it like takes his whole hope. And Sutter Kane is completely confident in what's going to happen next because he's already written it. And so he's powerless against the thing that's already written. Yeah. And they demonstrate that by he escapes this new world. He pops into town and he throws the fucking script down. But as soon as he goes in the hotel, like, oh, we have a package for you. And it's the script. And there's no way that he can get away from the script, or no way that he can get away from Sutter Kane.
Yeah. Yeah. He is the creation of a mad god, and that god controls his world. And there's nothing you can do about that. Like, you can't pick a fight with God, right? What are you going to do? He just goes, oh, you're like, I'm going to punch you, God. He goes, well, you don't have fists now. And then you just got little stubs, right? I mean, like, what can you do at that point? So that's the position that the Sam Neill character finds himself in, is like, oh, I'm in a world created by an insane God who's dictating everything that happens. So now I'm fucked, which leads up to the second half of the Frame story, which I think is so effective, which is we come back to Sam Neill in the insane asylum. He gets out of his room. He's wandering through this apocalyptic city now, which, as you said, is pretty low budget apocalypse. It's a car that's on fire and turned over, but still, the streets are empty, and you hear the sirens and you hear the sounds of chaos. And then he goes into a movie theater, which is a theater showing the movie adaptation of the Sutter Kane book that he lives in. And now he's watching the movie adaptation of the book he's in. And of course, he's a character in the movie, because of course he is, because he's a character in that book. And so now he's watching the things that he just did play out on screen, because he's now a character in the movie. And all he can do is sit there and laugh. He's just eating popcorn. He's laughing, watching the movie, because what else can you do? It's like you said, it's all foreordained. The book has already been written. The movie's already been written. The movie's already been filmed, and now it's playing at the theater, and you're just sitting there watching it, right? I think it's an incredibly effective end. I think it is a fantastic second half of the Frame story that actually adds to the creepiness of the movie rather than takes anything away.
And one thing I want to make sure that we get before we jump, because another effective part before we get to that ending is when he goes back to Charlton Heston, and he tells Charlton Heston, sits him down, and he tells him the whole story. Charlton Heston is like, has that look. He says, well, that's an interesting story, but you've already given me the book.
Right.
And then you look around at that point, and you realize like all the posters are for In the Mathematics. And he's like, what? And he says, you've already given me the book. And he's like, no. And he goes, and what are you talking about? Styles, that the lady never existed, that he went on the trip with. And then when he realizes that styles never existed. The whole lady that he hit on and crushed, he's like, yeah, I never sent you with that lady or whatever. That's what snaps him and puts him over the edge. And that was a really effective scene. And
yeah. I mean, it just goes to show that if you try to apply normal logic to the situation you're in, it will fail because you are not in a logical world. You are in the creation of this mad God, right?
All right. Well, I really enjoyed that movie. What's our top 5, Joseph?
Our top 5 is top Lovecraft inspired films.
Oh, I was hoping it would be 5 sexiest Sam Neill movies.
My first time he came on my radar as way late is Jurassic Park.
Yeah, he'd already been around for quite a while by that point, but yeah, I think that's when he came on a lot of people's radar because he's so good in that movie and the movie's so great. All right, so top 5 Lovecraft inspired films. So I am going to say it is a movie I have great affection for, which is Dagon. It's Stuart Gordon, and Stuart Gordon did he kept trying to make Lovecraft adaptations. He did From Beyond, which have you ever seen From Beyond?
Mm-mm. You should see it.
The guy who makes the machine that allows you to experience other dimensions, and then he gets eaten by a monster. And it is also not a great movie, but it's a movie I love, unabashedly love that movie. But Dagon was a very, very straightforward Lovecraft adaptation. It is the guy goes to the weird town on the sea where the people are starting to turn into fish monsters, and like it is the most straightforward Lovecraft adaptation I think I've ever seen. It is a fun movie to watch.
I think whenever we're doing a horror list and The Thing is a possibility, that Thing goes on the top.
I'm not sure that I would call The Thing Lovecraft.
Yeah, I wouldn't.
The Thing is not a Lovecraft movie to me.
I saw a lot of lists where it did include it and it didn't include it, and I was like,
I would not put The Thing on this list.
I was surprised that it was on the list, but I would never pass up number 2 to talk to. But Lovecraftian doesn't come to mind when I think about The Thing. I mean, exactly. Cosmic horror. Yeah, I don't. Oh, I mean, I guess you can make an argument.
We were trying to get the guy who made this movie on, but The Void.
Oh, The Void.
Yeah. So I love The Void. I really was hoping to get the guy who'd made that movie on this podcast. And Joseph, you got a hold of him, right? And we were talking about.
I'll try reaching out to him again.
I would love to talk about The Void. The Void. So, have you seen The Void, Wes?
No.
Okay, you need to watch The Void because the thing The Void does and manages to pull off that I would not have thought was possible is it does a genre skip in the middle of the movie and still works. So it starts out, it is Assault on Precinct 13 Carpenter. And then about halfway into the movie, it turns into In the Mouth of Madness and The Thing Carpenter.
Really?
And it manages that transition, and it never threw me out. Like I was like, oh shit, we're in a different movie now. How the fuck did that happen? I love The Void. And The Void has an Expanse alumni in it. The guy who played Franck DeGraff is in The Void.
Wait, is this the guy that did The Witch?
Yeah,
Kenneth Walsh.
Kenneth Walsh. Well, by the way, died last year, which we all greatly miss him. This is one of the last movies he made.
Oh, I can't wait to see it. I didn't hear about it. Was Event Horizon when that was also Sam Neill, correct?
It is Sam Neill, and I agree. I think it is borrowing a lot of Lovecraftian themes. I think Event Horizon belongs.
I'm a fan of Event Horizon.
I know you are. I'm not. I don't like Event Horizon, but it is definitely a Lovecraftian. From Beyond is the one I just mentioned, which is another Stuart Gordon. I have great affection for Cast a Deadly Spell.
Oh, I do too.
Which has
Fred Ward.
Fred Ward, thank you. Fred Ward as a investigator of supernatural stuff.
Yeah, I remember this one. Yeah, because I went through a Fred Ward spell.
Yeah,
I wanted to watch everything he did.
And so my top 5 is definitely going to include In the Mouth of Madness. I think In the Mouth of Madness is the best Lovecraftian adaptation that's not actually a Lovecraftian adaptation.
Yeah. That's such a good point because it is probably the most Lovecraftian movie I've seen, and it's not written by Lovecraft.
Yep.
But again, like you said, he allows everybody to participate in his universe, and as long as you participate in his universe, that's the thing.
I'm not saying this is the top 5. You don't have to keep putting them up at the top, but things on this list I really appreciate. I really enjoyed The Ritual. Have you seen The Ritual, Wes?
No.
I really enjoyed that movie. Dunwich Horror, I'm not sure. I mean, Dunwich Horror is okay. Call of Cthulhu is like a 20-minute short. It's not really a full movie. Reanimator is definitely Lovecraft because it's based on a Lovecraft story. It's another Stuart Gordon film. So Stuart Gordon kept trying to make Lovecraft films. He made Reanimator. He made From Beyond. He made Dagon.
You're a fan of Reanimator, right?
I enjoy Reanimator, but
yeah. We talked about that at length before.
Hellboy has the single best Lovecraftian scene ever in Hellboy. There's a scene in Hellboy where Hellboy is imagining what will happen if he accepts the power, if he allows himself to become the conduit for the elder gods and open up the gateway. And we cut to his imagination. He's sitting in this like blasted hellscape. He's got the huge horns. He's got a crown of fire on his head. And up above him, there's like these fiery clouds and just huge tentacles are dangling through the clouds, drifting across the ground. It's the best fucking 5-second Lovecraft scene ever.
And
for that alone, I would put Hellboy on this.
And Guillermo del Toro, I think we should put Hellboy. And
Hellboy should definitely be in our top 5.
Is a huge Lovecraft fan, and he for many years. Did you ever read about or remember when he wanted to make In the Mountains of Madness?
Yes. It was so frustrating that he never got to make that because I think he would have knocked it out of the fucking park.
And he was so motivated. And so it's almost like Jodorowsky's Dune, where they got so far down the road with that. And then and the same thing killed both projects, which is the money. The same thing killed both projects in that they realized these were going to be incredibly expensive movies. Del Toro was trying to get $100 million in The Mountains of Madness. That was the amount he was trying to get. Nobody thought a movie based on a Lovecraft story was ever going to make $100 million. Like they just didn't see the audience for it. That's what killed that movie. All right. Is that our top 5?
No, I mean, you need to put your opinion in here.
I'm cool with that.
So there have been 2 versions of Colorado Space that have been made recently. One with Nicolas Cage and another one that's much lower budget with probably no actors you would recognize. I enjoyed both of them. I don't think either of them is a great movie, but I did enjoy them.
Okay, because I almost watched that last night. I almost watched Color of Space, and you enjoyed it?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I was like going back and forth, and I was thinking about watching it. Okay, let's see what the Patreons did.
Patrons, they usually get a bunch of the ones we're going to pick. They got 3 out of 5 again.
And they would have got, I mean, the thing, because you talked me out of it being a Lovecraft movie, I can see the argument the other way, though. But I agree with you, but I can be convinced if the argument went the other way, because see, the thing
is sci-fi horror to me. Lovecraft is cosmic horror.
Cosmic horror. And there is something,
Dude, we should wrap this up because I really got to take a leak. So we're going to keep going.
All right. Thank you guys for hanging out. This was fun. Ty's got to go pee-pee in the mouth of madness.
I do, right in the mouth of madness.
Say goodbye, Ty.
Goodbye, Ty.